special edition of our Professional Development Series. Our Professional Development Series is our way of giving back to our members by providing business training and opportunities on a bi-monthly basis. We have the special edition today, and we're very pleased to have some very special guests. I'd like to start out first by introducing our sponsors. And the first sponsor, and I'd like to thank especially, is TPC and Eric Locklear for helping us put this event on.
First of all, on behalf of the PGA Tour and TPC Summerlin, we'd like to welcome you to our property. We're pretty proud of this building and the landscape that we have here. As you notice, a lot of activity is going on out here. In 3 weeks, we get to host some of the best golfers in the world. The Shriners Hospital for Children Open will be happening here October 3rd through the 6th. We just announced, I guess about 4 days ago, that the #1 player in the world, Brooks Koepka, will be playing. Adam Scott, Brandon Snyder, Bryson DeChambeau, Aaron Wise, who plays out on this property. And everybody always loves to see Phil Mickelson, and Phil Mickelson will be here at the property this year playing. So if you have not already got your tickets, get them, because I got a feeling we're going to be sold out this year. Our members, which we have some in attendance tonight, they do receive 2 clubhouse passes to the tournament. So there's perks that go along with that. And you also get 10 free tickets to give out to your friends and some reports. So please feel free to walk around the property tonight. Make yourself at home. We have a lounge midway into the building. Make yourself at home, see the facility. If you have any questions about it, please ask any of the staff members. And thank you so much for coming. It's going to be a wonderful night.
In addition to the TPC, I'd like to thank our other sponsors, Matt Engel and Insurance Office of America. Matt, would you stand up and say hello? Jeffrey Klein and the Gents Club. Jeff, there you are. That's there. Robert Rydell and Fanda Travel. James White, Concierge Dentistry. I saw And I'd like to give a special thank you to Lynn Price and the Las Vegas West Club for helping us. Rotary is a global network of 1.2 million neighbors, friends, leaders, and problem solvers who see the world where people unite and take action to create lasting change across the globe, in our communities, and in ourselves personally. Our mission in Rotary is to provide service to others, to promote integrity and advance world understanding, goodwill, and peace through our fellowship of business, professional, and community leaders. The Summerlin Rotary Club has been in your community for 20 years. We've been active with working with schools and other nonprofits within the community, and we're proud to be a part of this community. I'd like to recognize our president, Glenn Ritt, in the way in the back of the room. Glenn was the main driver in putting this event on this afternoon, did most of the heavy lifting, so thank you, Glenn, for doing this. Please visit our table outside afterwards if you haven't already. We are selling tickets to our wine raffle, which will be held next month. Some fabulous wines we're going to be raffling off, so each ticket is a 1 out of 10 chances, or you have 10 chances with each ticket to win a bottle of wine. And after the program, on your seats there was a green raffle ticket somewhere there. After the program, we'll be raffling off 10 of Don's books, and so we'll be drawing raffle tickets for that. So that's your ticket to a chance to win a book. If you're not a winner, Don has books available for sale. It's for a $50 donation to the Smith Center Endowment Fund. So it's a very good cause, and if you're not a lucky winner,
I will sign all those books.
Yeah, Don will sign those books. Thanks. Before I introduce Don and Myron, I'd like to acknowledge all the people that are here in the room today. We've got a wide cross-section of business leaders, nonprofit leaders, and even some clergy. And that's part of what we in Rotary are all about, is bringing people together to make our community a better place to live. our heartfelt effort to reach out, connect, and learn and to partner with you. We look forward to getting to know all of you better. And so now I would like to introduce our speakers this afternoon. Don Snyder, currently chairman of the board of the Smith Center for the Performing Arts. Don led the campaign that raised $500 million for this amazing cultural center. And as a former member and chair of the UNLV Foundation, he led the university's successful $537 million Invent the Future campaign. That's more than $1 billion between those two campaigns that Don has raised to invest in the Las Vegas community. He has served on the board. He served on the boards of more than...
And people still return my telephone
And they
calls.
He served on the boards of more than 15 public and private companies, numerous local nonprofits, and several legislative commissions. He's recognized for his decades of outstanding community service, including the 2013 Philanthropist of the Year Award given by then Governor Brian Sandoval. Don, his commitment to the intersection of commerce and community, and a lot about what he'll be talking about this afternoon, embodies the spirit and the mission of Rotary. It's what we're all about as Rotarians. This makes him an outstanding speaker to impart his wisdom, experience, and inspiration to us all. Don has been involved with the UNLV for 3 decades, including as its acting president, as well as Dean of the Harrah College of Hospitality and Executive Dean for Strategic Development. He began his professional life in banking, and in his 22 years with First Interstate Bank, which is now Wells Fargo, he rose from a management trainee, that's how I started in banking too, but I didn't end up where you were, to chairman of the board and CEO of First Interstate Bank of Nevada from 1987 to 1991. In addition, he co-founded Bank of Nevada and its parent Western Alliance Bank Corporation, growing that from a modest $8 million in assets to more than $25 billion. Don led efforts to develop what is today the Fremont Street Experience, serving as its chairman, president, and CEO before joining Boyd Gaming Corporation and eventually becoming its president as well. When he retired from Boyd, Don devoted his attention to the dream of building the Smith Center, teaming up with Myron Martin, who is today the president and CEO of the Smith Center. Myron has graciously agreed to share the evening with John and will be joining in the conversation and taking your questions tonight. Myron has produced and presented a vast variety of well-regarded productions, including first-run touring attractions and internationally acclaimed performers in music, theater, and dance. Myron has been called the keeper of the vision for the Smith Center, and what a vision it has been, gentlemen. It is, as many times as I've been there over the years, I'm thrilled every time I walk in the door. It's such a magnificent
So are we.
place. Yes. In fact, Myron's Cabaret is named for Myron. We were there Saturday.
Not this Myron, it's a different guy.
In the first year alone, the Smith Center hosted more than 450 performances in 3 venues and saw nearly 500,000 tickets sold to programs such as Wicked, which is open and running for how long is Wicked?
3 weeks starting tomorrow.
3 weeks starting tomorrow. So if you haven't seen it, it's a great show. You got to see it. We have Thursday night tickets.
Good.
Named as Las Vegas 2012 Band of the Year by Vegas 7 magazine, Myron is a highly respected community leader, proud Las Vegan, and champion for the arts. So please join me in welcoming Don Snyder and Myron.
Thank you, Dave. That was really embarrassing. My mother would have been really proud. It is nice to be here. I have a lot of history here. I was a founding member of TPC Summerlin. When it opened in 1991. And so we were members for 25 years. And so we have a lot of history here. And it's nice to see how good it looks right now.
And by the way, there are seats in the front row here on the groom's side.
Now, wait a minute.
Yeah, go
Myron.
ahead.
Myron, we're not supposed to have, this is not supposed to be a funny thing, right?
I'll come down and sit with my wife.
Okay. Oh, well, you're on the bride's side. We need some people to sit down here on the groom's side because I'm embarrassed that it's something about me. So anyone in the back, please join us up
Yeah,
front.
my side's totally full.
Yeah, I know. Of it. Oh, no one got that one. Full of it. Hello, everyone. I'm Myron Martin, and it's so great to be here to ask a few questions of Don Snyder. You know, we owe so much to Don and Dee and what they've done in this community. I mean, let what you just heard sink in for a minute. Between those two projects, Smith Center and UNLV, he raised over $1 billion. $1 billion. Yeah.
At the same time.
And at the same time, and during the worst economic downturn in our state's history. So I think that's terrific. And I want to give a little shout out to Melissa and Sam for joining us in the front row. Thank you. So Don has always said that he and I, for the last 20 plus years, have been, in his term, locked at the hip. And so today we're going to talk about some things that I've had the benefit of riding along his coattails with. But I think it's important we start with a little conversation around the book. It's too heavy for me to pick up.
I'll get it for you.
Okay, yeah, thanks. It's a big book called Taking the Lead, and it's Don's story about coming to Las Vegas and some of the wonderful things he's done. So let's start there. And Don, why don't you tell the people why in the world you would go to all the effort to write a giant yellow page-sized book like this?
Well, first of all, it's not quite as intimidating as it looks. It's about 500 pages, but half of those pages are pictures, and so that helps a little bit, but it also doubles as an exercise device because it is so heavy. And those are the reasons that I did it. Now, when we came here in the late 80s, we expected that we'd be here for 3 or 4 years as part of a corporate stop, and then we'd be on to someplace else. My wife, when we first came here, said what a lot of people do when they hear that they're moving to Las Vegas: "You want me to move where?" So we came here, thought we'd be here for a few years. It's obviously been longer than that. It's now been 32 years that we've been here, and we've had a chance to get involved with a lot of different things. And so Jack Sheehan, who's the co-author of this book with me, has a lot of experience writing these types of books. He's been after me for the last few years to write the book, and also UNLV has an oral history. Thank you. UNLV has an oral history project, and some of the projects I've been involved with, they wanted to capture that as part of the oral history. I thought this would be a good way to get some of those things taken care of that I've wanted to in the form of the book and the oral history. And it also was helpful in terms of getting rid of a lot of the clutter both in my mind and my garage. I think over the years, as all of you in this room know, you collect a lot of things, memorabilia. And I was able to get rid of about 6 boxes of memorabilia by capturing things in the book that were really important to me.
You're talking about being married for 32 years. It's clear that this is one of the great marriages on this planet. Don and Dee are true partners. But I don't know if you remember this story, but as you were just talking about Dee just then, I was looking out at Mr. Kaiser, the artistic director from the ballet, who was here, and I reflected back to a time when you and I were at the Black and White Ball, and they were auctioning off a Harley-Davidson motorcycle. Do you remember that?
Sure do.
And I walked up to Don. He was looking at it, and I said, "Don, are you gonna buy that motorcycle?" And to that, he said,
"If I buy that motorcycle, it will be the most expensive motorcycle ever purchased." And Myron says, "Well, why would that be?" I says, "It will cost me half of everything I own."
Thank you, Nevada Valley Theater, for that.
I'd forgotten about that.
Yeah, there are a lot of stories.
Yeah.
By the way, we're going to be here a while, but there will be breakfast. So 32 years. You guys moved here. You started in what I might call humble beginnings in South Dakota and Wyoming, and I just wonder if you might share a little bit about what it was like to move to Las Vegas.
Well, I do tell some of my humble beginnings in the book. I mean, I was born in Aberdeen, South Dakota, and I grew up in South Dakota and then in Wyoming. And people will oftentimes say, boy, growing up, you must have developed a real passion for the performing arts. I said, yeah, I grew up in Wyoming and South Dakota where they have lots of world-class performing arts. No, they didn't. But I lived the first 5 years of my life on a farm where we had no running water for the first 3 years. I think that coming from that type of a background, it gave me appreciation for things and probably made me work a little bit harder when it came to developing a career. But I was in South Dakota and Wyoming until I graduated from the University of Wyoming in 1969 and moved to California.
And is it true that one of your jobs early on was changing big 18-wheel truck tires?
I changed earth mover tires in addition to
even bigger than that.
Yeah, my dad was in the tire business the last few years that I was in Wyoming, so I had a chance to work road construction projects and things like that during the summertime. In fact, one of my greatest sources of inspiration was a guy I worked with on a road construction job in Jackson Hole, Wyoming one summer. And we would go to work at 4:30 every afternoon, and it rained starting at 4 o'clock every day except for 2 days for the 8 weeks that I was there. And so we worked in the mud, and when I wasn't changing tires, I was a grease monkey. And the guy that I worked with, who was the great inspiration to had me go back to school and work hard, would say almost every single day, he says, I don't know why you're going to college. I got this here brother-in-law, and he went to college and got a degree, and I make more money in the summertime than he does all year long as a forest ranger. And then he would go to his 1957 Rambler that was parked down by the river, and that's where he would spend the night. And then he would go home on the weekends to wherever his home was. But he doesn't realize it, but he was great inspiration to me to go back to school, work hard, get a degree, and then work hard on my career.
Don Snyder's Nightmares. His book was titled Don Snyder, Forest Ranger. And what about the bank? I mean, you came here for First Interstate Bank of Nevada. What were the early challenges for kind of integrating into this community and running a big bank?
Well, first of all, after I got over the hurdle of telling my wife that we're moving to Nevada, I then told her we're moving to Reno, Nevada. Our bank was headquartered in Reno, Nevada. So one of the biggest challenges was when I first got here and seeing what was happening at this end of the state, I would ask the question a lot: why are we headquartered in Reno, Nevada? Now, as the largest bank in the state at the time and the oldest bank in the state at the time, there were historical reasons why that was the case. I mean, that was the power center politically and economically for many, many years, but that was changing. So we went through a strategic planning process, something I'll probably talk about here tonight, and laid the foundation for moving the headquarters to Las Vegas. And so it was a relatively short period of time, 3 or 4 months after we moved to Reno, that I came home and told my wife that I hope you aren't settled in too well, because we're going to move to Las Vegas. We're moving the headquarters. And it was actually an easier conversation than I thought, because my wife is a native Southern Californian. She had never driven on icy roads before. And I still remember flying back into Reno one time, and we'd come from separate places, and so we both had our car at the airport, and we pulled out of the parking lot at the airport, and I saw what I recognized, but I knew that she didn't. It was black ice on the road. And she went skidding down the road, and so the move to Las Vegas was facilitated greatly by the black ice in Reno. And so that was a really important decision, and strategically, part of what we went through is we were the largest bank in the state. But if you look, I had a chart at the time, and it showed the growth rate of our bank, and it was a very gradual growth rate like this. The bank that was headquartered and started here in Las Vegas, Valley Bank, which is now B of A, it was growing like this. And so when we went through that planning process, the lines were about right here. And so it didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that if we didn't do something different, we weren't going to be the largest bank in the state anymore. And that was important, not only the bank and its management team, but our board. Even though our board was more Northern Nevada centric, it was important to be the largest bank in the state. So we made the decision, and I'm pleased to say that First Interstate, which is now Wells Fargo, is the largest bank in the state, and Valley Bank, which is now B of A, is the second largest bank in the state.
And I'm going to come out of sequence a little bit, but speaking of banks, tell us what caused you to think about founding a brand new bank in Nevada with your friend Bill Boyd.
How many people know Bill Boyd in the room? Yeah, Bill Boyd is a legend in his family. His dad, in moving the family here, made the family a legend. I'd known Bill Boyd from the time that we moved here. They were the largest customer of our bank, and so I knew Bill from the time that we got here and had a very good relationship with him. And Bill is the one, among others, but primarily Bill, that encouraged me after I left First Interstate Bank when the Wells Fargo thing was happening, that I should get involved with the downtown hotel casino owners and talk about doing a project that became the Fremont Street Experience, which we'll probably talk about a bit. So Bill was very instrumental in getting me engaged there. And it was while we were doing the Fremont Street Experience that he invited me to lunch at the Las Vegas Country Club, which is, if you know Bill, that's where you always have lunch. And so we were sitting there, and after we get through the niceties, I say, Bill, what do you want to talk about at lunch? He says, and he went on to explain that he had been involved, he and his family had been involved in starting two banks in the history of Las Vegas. One is, the most significant one is Nevada State Bank today. And he went on to explain that both of those banks were acquired by out-of-state banks, and he'd like to start a bank that would be a significant Nevada-owned, Nevada-managed bank, and would I be interested in helping start the bank. And so we left the lunch with a handshake that we were going to start the bank, and with a lot of his money and a little bit of his time and a little bit of my money, a lot for me, and a lot of my time, we started what became Bank of Nevada and then Western Alliance Bank Corporation, which you heard Dave talk about. And Western Alliance Bank Corporation, the last 4 years, Forbes magazine has ranked it among the top 10 banks in America. And Bank Director magazine just rated the bank the #1 bank in the $5 to $50 billion range. But it all started with lunch with Bill Boyd in 1993, and we opened in 1994.
And you mentioned Fremont Street Experience, Mr. Boyd, but there was a whole cast of characters during the start. If you remember when Fremont Street Experience started, all those casino owners were, they were a colorful bunch of characters, right? So I wonder, because Fremont Street Experience was the thing that brought them all together, I wonder what it was like to have to work with them individually and as a group.
Well, first of all, these were guys that all knew each other, and you have to think back to that time. That was in 1992 that we started the discussions. At that time, you had the developments on the Strip that were making significant changes in the competitive dynamics in this town. The Strip was exploding at that time. The Mirage opened in 1989. And then also the locals casinos, the Sam's Towns of the world and the Palace Stations had emerged. And so the competitive environment for downtown was tough. They were hit by both of those developments. And so I was asked to come in and help them develop a plan where they could collaborate. Because it was clear to them that they had to do something together to compete with some of the larger things that were affecting their business. And so this is a group of guys that that all knew each other. They competed against one another. In some cases, they probably didn't like one another, and in some cases didn't trust one another. Not necessarily a recipe for collaboration. And so it was an interesting process. But you had Steve Wins, Jack Binions, Bill Boyd, Mel Exper, Jeannie Hood, one of the great ladies, historical gaming ladies in our industry. Jerry Turk, who was an investment banker out of New York that was 50% owner of the Fitzgeralds at the time. And then you had all their number 2 guys, but the senior guys were all at the table. In fact, when I was asked to do this project, I said I would do it under 2 conditions. The first condition was that we need to go through a planning process, the one that I'm going to share with you here tonight. And the second condition was that you principals have to sit at the table and participate in that process. And to a person, they agreed to do that, and that was absolutely critical to us getting that project done. That was at the time the largest public sector, private sector partnership in the history of the state when it was done. The Smith Center became the next largest public sector, private sector partnership. But interesting dynamics with that group, and there were probably a lot of stories. I tell some of the stories in my book.
Yeah. And one of the stories you don't tell in the book, maybe always going to hate me for asking this one. Don always had a way of kind of internalizing things, processing them, and being prepared for answers, including with the media.
What are you going to do here, Myron?
Don, I'm going to ask you to tell the story about how you handled the media's questions about the pigeon problems in Fremont Street.
Now, wait a minute. There's media here tonight, Myron. We had a pigeon problem on Fremont Street in those days. And we wanted to deal with the pigeon problems in the right way, so we hired a pigeon consultant. And the pigeon consultant advised us on various ways that we could get rid of the pigeons, and we were sensitive about doing it in the best possible way. And we knew that there would be concerns from various groups. I'm not sure I'm comfortable telling the story.
It's too late now.
But I will. So we hired the pigeon consultant, and the plan that we agreed upon is that the pigeon consultant would humanely trap the pigeons, track them into cages, humanely capture them, and then they would be sent to raptor rehabilitation centers. And so I told that story to at least 6 different members of the media, and not one person, not one member of the media said, "What does that mean? You sent them to a raptor rehabilitation center?"
They thought it was a pigeon rehabilitation facility.
So the truth was the pigeons were humanely captured in cages, and then they were sent in frozen state to raptor rehabilitation centers as food for raptors, hawks and eagles and things like that.
Yeah, I know. Yes, I know. I am so sorry I made him tell you that story. So we've heard you talk about kind of, or tee up your strategic planning model. Listen, in the 20 plus years I've known Don Snyder, I talk about it like it's my 20-something years of attending Snyder University. Every day you learn something. But Don's way of being strategic about everything he does is very unique. And his approach to strategic planning is uniquely his. So I know we've got a couple of PowerPoint slides here, and I think you'll all really appreciate kind of seeing how Don thinks through all big decisions with his strategic planning model. So there you go.
All right. Well, I don't want to spend a lot of time with this. It does happen to be covered in my book, and there's actually an appendix in the book.
And you know, you can get a copy for $50 donation to the Smith Center.
So if you get intrigued by it, you can do that. But I think even before I go through my strategic thinking model, I like the word thinking model as opposed to planning model, although I do use it from a planning point of view. I have one other Fremont Street experience story I'd like to tell, because we talk about that collection of people, the owners downtown. It really was interesting group. And at the end of the day, they did come together. This model was a big part of it. But we were in a meeting at the Golden Nugget Executive Boardroom one day, and we had all these people. Bill Boyd was sitting to my right, and you went around the table, and it was Jack Minion and Jackie Gaughan and Mel Exper and Jeannie Hood and Jerry Turk and Steve Wynn. Steve Wynn was sitting down. Bill Boyd was right here, and I was sitting at the head of the table. Steve Wynn was down at the other end of the table. And Steve Wynn, I'm a little bit uncomfortable telling this story. But Steve Wynn was going off like Steve Wynn can do. He was talking nonstop for a long period of time. And basically his message to everybody in the room was, I know this is because we're talking about the model of the planning process we're going through. He says, I know this is a tough thing and we have tough decisions to make, but it's okay. I know that you guys aren't as smart as I am, but that's okay because all you have to do is do everything listen to me and do everything that I say and it'll be okay. And that was the basic message. That was the basic message he was giving to this group. And I was watching around the table and the blood pressures were rising all around. And all of a sudden, Kurt thud on the table, it shook the table. And it was Bill Boyd hitting his fist on the table. Now, I've known Bill since I got here, 32 years ago. In 32 years, I've heard Bill use the F word 3 times. But Bill used it that day. And he says, Steve, shut the F up. And the room went silent, including Steve Wynn. And so that was an interesting time, and so the first time I told that story with Bill Boyd present, I was a little bit uncomfortable telling the story, and I said, Bill, there's a lot of people standing around. I said, Bill, I'm thinking about telling a story, and I want to make sure you're okay with it. And so I explained this is when we were in the boardroom at the Golden Nugget, and Steve Wynn was down at the end of the table. He said, go ahead and tell the story. So I told the story just the way that I did now. And he laughed, which is a great sense of relief for me. But then he went on to say, but Don, tell him the rest of the story. I said, the rest of the story? What's the rest of the story, Bill? He said, don't you remember a few months later when you were president of Boyd Gaming, and Steve came to us and invited us to be joint venture partners in the project in Atlantic City that became the Borgata. And one of the most significant things that Boyd Gaming ever did. And then he laughed even louder. But it really spoke to the fact that a personality like Steve Wynn, I think, respects a pushback at times. And so it really was an important, significant moment.
Well, that's a really great story, Don, but no. No,
Okay.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
All right, so do we really want to do this? All right. All right, so I refer to this as a strategic thinking model, and it's something, is it moving? Ooh, all right, so a lot of people, when they see this, say, it looks like, and they are familiar with McKinsey and Company, they'll say, this looks a lot like the McKinsey wheel, and it really does, because early in my banking career, I did a lot of work, had McKinsey and Company do work for me as I did some things at the bank that were significant. And so while this is looks a lot like theirs, it's been personalized to how I operate. But I really use it in terms of thinking strategically about problems. I do use it from a planning point of view when it makes sense to do a strategic plan. But I also use it in problem solving, and there's a lot of things that are just common to those different exercises that are captured in here. And so it really starts with talking about a situational assessment, making sure that you understand kind of the hand that you're dealt, to use a Las Vegas term, but getting the facts and figures, getting the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that planners oftentimes talk about, but really understanding the situation that you're facing. And so it's really important, and I talk about that being kind of the foundation to a planning or a strategic process. Because if you don't understand where you are, and if you don't, that was really one of the advantages of having all the principles at the Fremont downtown involved in that planning process, because it got everybody on the same page, and it really helped when there were differences of opinion at a later date. You could go back and say, but don't you remember why we got together, what we talked about? And so the situational assessment is really a foundational part of this process. The second part is really a picture of what you want to be when you grow up. And I don't get hung up on the terminology between vision and mission, but it's really a picture of what does success look like, and how do you paint a real clear picture of that. And then how do you define success? What are the measures of success? I'm a big believer that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And so having metrics that allow you to know what defines success is really important, and then setting goals and objectives around that. And then once you understand what the measures of success are, what the goals and objectives are that you set for yourself to achieve that vision, operating in that environment or that situation that you find yourself in, what are the core strategies? And I'm a big believer in keeping it as simple as possible. What are the 3 or 4 or 5 key things that you need to do organizationally to accomplish those goals and objectives and to achieve the success that you need to achieve? And if you're going into a planning process, you need to drill down a little bit with more specific action plans and things like that. But one of the reasons I like to keep it as simple as possible is if you do a big, thick strategic plan that looks like my book, it goes onto a shelf and people never look at it. And that's one of the reasons I talk about strategic thinking. I think it needs to be a dynamic process because the world twists and turns on you, and you don't want to be locked into something that's sitting on somebody's shelf. But the core strategies, those 3 or 4 or 5 key things that you need to do organizationally and have people understand them are really important. And then next, what is the proper organizational structure? What is the ideal organizational structure? How should you organize yourself to do those core strategies to achieve the goals and objectives that you set out for yourself to accomplish the vision, operating in that environment that you find yourself? And then next, what kind of people do you need? What kind of skills do those people need to have operating in that organization? And I find oftentimes people reverse the order and they say, well, we have this set of people. How do you move these people? How do you organize these people? And I believe very strongly in starting with an ideal organizational structure and then and let that drive then your evaluation of your people, because that then will identify where you need to enhance your staff, perhaps, where you need to do training and development and that type of thing. And then what kind of resources and support structures do you need? That's everything from money to technology to whatever else is needed to give those people operating in that organization what they need to do those core strategies and achieve the goals and objectives and therefore the vision that's out in front of you. And then finally, as I mentioned before, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So I'm a big believer in having a report card that allows you to measure your success, realizing that you're not going to get there overnight. I'm a believer when you set goals and objectives, you set milestones along the way so you can celebrate success along the way. But the only way you can do that is by measuring the results, and the report card is all about that. So that's really in a very short version the model that I use, and the book, as I say, has a little bit more explanation of what's behind all that. We did that with the Smith Center.
We did. We did that with the Smith Center, and now you know why Don Snyder was dean of the Hotel College at UNLV and president at the university. That was your lecture, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. But speaking of higher ed and K-12, not only do U and D have a school named for you, but we've talked about your commitment to higher education in Las Vegas. Give us a little bit on how you feel we're doing with education in general in our state and where we're heading.
All right, it's one of the most critical issues, and it has been from the very beginning. I'm going to talk about higher education first and why I got involved there. One of the things that is nice about being the CEO of the largest bank in the state is it allows you to pick your places when it comes to getting involved in different types of organizations, particularly community-based organizations. And so there were three things that I said were most important priorities in terms of me getting involved. One was education. Second was social services, and so I got involved with United Way from the very beginning. And right now I'm forgetting what the third one is. But in terms of education, higher education, early in my banking career, I had the opportunity to put together an MBA training program for new MBA recruits. And so part of that was to recruit at various universities, graduate schools, primarily in the Southwest, but other places as well. And from that experience, I saw where there were good partnerships with the university and where there weren't such good partnerships. When I lived in Taiwan, when I managed our bank in Taipei, Taiwan for 3 years, it was right after the U.S. de-recognized Taiwan in favor of mainland China, and it created a real crisis in Taiwan, politically and economically, because people wondered how they were going to survive economically. And what I saw in Taiwan is government come together with higher education, National Taiwan University in that case, and business to create a future for Taiwan that is developed into what Taiwan is today. So I saw a tremendous partnership. So when I came here, I had adopted the phrase that you can't have a great community without a great university. As I got more involved with the university, particularly when I moved from being a volunteer to actually working inside the university, I saw it was more than that. And so I adopted the phrase, and I used it in the planning process that we conducted when I was the interim president, the acting president of UNLV, that the phrase was, you can't have a great community without a great university connected to that community. And so we talked a lot about creating bridges, two-way bridges between the community and the university. And a lot of what's been done in the university in the last few years reflects that community engagement. And what I saw is lack of as much of a bridge as we needed. So higher education from the very beginning was important. K through 12, same situation. I mean, in one sense, I think we can celebrate the fact that we're no longer the lowest ranking state in America as a result of the news that you probably saw a week or so ago. But we still have a long way to go. And I think that the ratings don't necessarily tell the whole story. So it's embarrassing to be the 49th state out of 50. But when you look around the Clark County School District, there are some incredible successes. The partnership that exists between the Smith Center and the Clark County School District is one of those. There are some wonderful teachers, some wonderful administrators, and I'm a big believer that the glass is half full more than the glass is half empty, and that you need to find success and build on those successes. And so I think that a lot of what's going on right now is identifying those areas of success. I've gotten very actively involved with the Public Education Foundation in the last couple of years. I've always been involved with the Clark County School District. And I see tremendous progress being made, but I think it's the highest priority that we have as a community to march up that list a lot beyond where we are today. But it'll take some time. I think one of the things, wearing my former banker's hat, is I don't think that most people fully appreciate the impact of compounded growth rates. The first 21 years that we were here, Nevada was the fastest growing state in America 20 of those 21 years. And then we went through the recession, and that created its own problems, and now we're back to being the second fastest growing state in America. I think what people miss sometimes is the impact of that compounded growth rate. Record growth on top of record growth on top of record growth just creates tremendous needs, and it's hard to keep up. And we're a busy town, and so I understand a lot of why we perhaps aren't where we want to be, but we can't give up on the fight. I mean, it's really important. That's the #1 priority.
And tell us what it's like when you pull up to the Don and Dee Snyder Elementary School and walk in the front door.
How about the Ortwine School too? We have another. We were talking about that earlier. There is no better. There is no better feeling. There is no better recognition. There is no better, bigger honor than to have a school named after you as a thank you for what you have done for the community and for education. So it's a tremendous honor. It means a lot.
Good, good. So we're here at the TPC. I don't have to remind you, but for everyone else's sake, there would be no Smith Center without Don Snyder, that's for sure. But there would be no Smith Center with a guy named Fred W. Smith, whose office was right across the street at the Donald W. Reynolds Foundation. And each and every time Don and I would come over for a meeting, we would park our cars here in the TPC parking lot, and we'd have a pre-meeting in one of our cars, and we'd talk about what we're going to talk about and make sure that we're prepared. And that happened often.
With Fred Smith, you had to be prepared.
Yes, yeah, and by the way, as the chairman of my board, this is the guy that comes to a board meeting with every page with yellow highlighter marks on things and little questions in the margins. You know, he always does his homework. But we always prepared because we knew when we walked across the street, Lynn Mosier knows that you had to be prepared when you walked in the Donald W. Reynolds Foundation. And by the way, arts and culture was not even on their list of things that their mission was to serve. Yet Don Snyder, because Fred Smith was on his board at First Interstate Bank, got a meeting. And it was just the two of them, and they had the first conversation, and I swear to you, we didn't fill out an application. We didn't make a formal request, and before you know it, the Smith Center had its first $50 million gift, and it's this guy. So talk a little bit about Fred Smith. Yeah.
Okay, first of all, I have to correct one of your facts. There were three of us in that first meeting. Steve Anderson was the...
Steve Anderson, who's out there playing golf right now. That's why I didn't mention him.
Yeah, he was going to be here, but they have some kind of a big golf thing going on, and so he's not. But Steve Anderson was the president of the Donald W. Reynolds Foundation. Fred Smith was the chairman. So Fred was on my board at First Interstate Bank, and so I knew Fred from the very beginning. I met him at my first board meeting at First Interstate when we moved here, before we moved here. Fred was my toughest board member. He was always prepared. He asked the toughest questions, and he never smiled, and so never knew exactly where I stood with Fred, but I did know I could pick up the phone and call him. And so it was one December day in 2004, when I picked up the phone to call Steve and to call Fred. And I said, Fred, I know you're generally aware of the Performing Arts Center project that we're working on because his doctor, Dr. Keith Bowman, was on our board, and I knew that they had talked, and Keith had shared some of the things with Fred. So I said, I know that you're generally aware of what we're doing, but we've never sat and talked about it. I'd like to come out and meet with you and share with you where we are, what we're working on, and where I think this project is going, because we're at a threshold moment. We're talking with elected officials, both at the state level, as well as the county and the city level, and we have a lot going on, and I'd like to bring you up to speed on it. And I promise I won't ask you for anything when we meet in this first meeting. I was careful. I chose my words carefully. So he agreed to meet with me, and so we met just before Christmas in 2004. There were three of us in the meeting: Fred and Steve Anderson and me. And I had a stack of papers with me, papers that were very much what we were using to talk with elected officials at the time. and the media at the time. And so I went through it, and we were together about an hour and a half, and I went through my material. He asked a lot of good questions, and at the end of the hour and a half meeting, he says, "Well, Don," he says, "that's all very interesting." He says, "But we don't do arts projects around here at the Donald W. Reynolds Foundation, so I don't think our board's going to be interested in supporting your project." So I'm deflated a bit, but he turned to Steve Anderson at the time and said, "But Steve, this is a bigger project than I thought. They've made more progress than I thought. I think that our board at least needs to be aware of this project, even though they're likely not to support the project." So he said to Steve, "Steve, I'd like you to present at our next board meeting what we've heard here today." And I said, "That's great. When's the meeting going to be?" He says, "January 31st, 2005. And I said, "That's great. What time shall I be there? And what material do you want me to bring?" He goes, "We don't operate that way here at the Reynolds Foundation." He says, "Steve's going to make the presentation to our board. You're not going to be there. And you've given us enough material where Steve can pull together his presentation. And if he has any questions, he'll give you a call." Am I right? Okay. So I said, "That's great." So this was a really busy time. We had a tremendous amount going on with the Performing Arts Center project at that time. I was just in my last few months as president of Boyd Gaming Corporation, so we were transitioning leadership there. And so it was a really busy time. I went back to work with Myron and on the things that we were doing with the Performing Arts Center. And next thing I know, I got a call February 1st, the day after their board meeting. And of course, the light came on as soon as I saw it was Steve Anderson on the phone. And Steve said, so I said to Steve, I said, "How'd the meeting go?" He said, "Well, it went fine, but Fred and I both want you to know that this is not our kind of project, and the Reynolds Foundation is probably not going to support it, but they would like to know more about it." I said, "That's great." So he said, I said, "When would," so they formed a special committee to meet with us. And I said, "When would you like to meet?" And he said, "February 14th. So I'm opening my calendar, and I have a totally packed day. In fact, I may have been traveling that day. I said, "I'll be there. Who would you like me to bring with me?" And he says, "No one. You're going to come alone. You're going to meet with Fred and me, and we're going to have lunch together, and we're going to talk." Did I miss this something? I lose track of where I am. So boom, 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 boom. Let me think a minute. I didn't talk about meeting with our presentation to the committee. Or let me think.
That came later.
Okay.
That came later. You're good.
Okay.
Keep going.
All right. All right. So we were told that we had the presentation to make to the committee, and so we pulled the presentation together. It was Myron, it was Alan Feldman from MGM, if you know Alan, and me, and the three of us pulled together a PowerPoint presentation, and we went out to the Reynolds Foundation in the boardroom, and we made our case. And so we went through our PowerPoint presentation. And they asked a lot of good questions. Fred Smith was not in this meeting. His son Wes was. And the chairman was an old family friend, an old friend of Donald W. Reynolds. And he was chairing the special committee. He was from Oklahoma. And so we're about an hour into our presentation, and I see him looking at his watch. And I said, "You know, I should have asked this at the beginning, but how much time do we have?" He says, "Well, I've got a flight back to Oklahoma. I have an important meeting tomorrow, and there's only one flight. I've got to be on it. You have 10, maybe 15 minutes. And so I said, "Okay, well, there's more of a PowerPoint presentation, but we've really talked about the essence of what the project is all about." And so I said I promised Fred when he agreed to meet with me in December that I wouldn't ask for anything at that meeting, but I can't let this meeting go without making an ask. And I went on to say that this project is going to be the most important project in our history in Nevada because of how it's going to impact our community forever. And so we think it should have the largest single philanthropic gift in the history of the state of Nevada. And second, I know how important Nevada and Las Vegas was to Don Reynolds' company, Don Ray Media. They owned the RJ at the time. They owned Don Ray Outdoor. This was their most valuable asset. Fred spent his entire professional career that he was with Don Ray Media, for the most part, here in Las Vegas. He raised his family here. So I said, I know how important Las Vegas and Nevada was to Don Reynolds and his company. So we think this should be the largest single philanthropic gift in the history of the Reynolds Foundation. So we'd like to ask for $50 million, $50 million. And then I turned to Wes Smith at the time. I said, Wes, I know your dad's not here, but I know how important your dad was. He sat on my board. He was a tough board member, but I know how important he was to our bank, how important he was to the business community. And so, while we don't have a vote, if you saw fit to give us the $50 million and then decided to put Fred Smith's name on the Performing Arts Center, we would be honored to have it. With that, the chairman closed his notebook. The meeting ended. Everybody said, thank you, nice presentation, and we all walked away. That was on a Thursday, right? That was on a Thursday. Friday, I got a call from Steve Anderson, and he said, Fred, we told Fred about the meeting, and Fred wants you to, I'm telling the story wrong, so I'm going to back up a minute. I got a call from Pat, Fred Smith's secretary. Now, Pat I had known forever because she was Fred's assistant forever, and she has a very distinctive voice, and she's all business. And she says, Mr. Snyder, Mr. Smith wants you to come and have lunch with him on whatever, on the next, sometime the next week. And that's when I looked at my calendar and saw that I was totally booked up. And I said, I'll be there. Who would Mr. Smith like me to bring with me? Pat says, Mr. Smith wants you to come alone and just be you and Mr. Anderson, and he wants to talk about the meeting that you had with the committee of our board. So I said, I'll be there. So I went and walked into the building right across the street here. I walked into the reception desk, and as I'm waiting, I was there early, because I know you have to be early with Mr. Smith. So I'm there, I'm standing at the reception desk, and all of a sudden I hear this voice coming down the stairway. Fred's office was upstairs, and he says, didn't say hello or anything. He said, that was a pretty bold request you made of our committee last week. And I said, yes, sir, but this is going to be the most important building to be. He cut me off mid-sentence. He said, I know, you told the committee it's going to be the most important building built in Nevada in our lifetime. He says, that may be true, but let me take a few minutes before we have lunch and share with you how we here at the Reynolds Foundation look at naming opportunities. So he turned around and started walking back upstairs to his office. Steve Anderson is there by that point, so Steve and I follow him into his office, and he takes me over to the wall and shows there's a picture on the wall. He points to it. And it was real clear. It was Razorback Stadium in Fayetteville, Arkansas, where Fred and his wife Mary grew up in Arkansas. That's where the headquarters of Don Ray Media was. He says, see this building? I said, yes, sir. He says, they really like their football in Arkansas. He says, they like their football so much, this is probably the most important building in the entire state of Arkansas. And I said, yes, sir. He says, they asked us to put our name on the most important building in the entire state of Arkansas. He says, do you know how much it costs for us to put our name, and we agreed to do it. Do you know how much it costs for us to put our name on the most important building in the entire state of Arkansas? I says, no, sir. He says, $20 million. And then he took me to two other pictures, and it was the same thing. He said, come with me. And we walked out to the boardroom where we were going to have lunch, and there's a big leather-bound book, bigger than my book, leather-bound book, and he opened it up, and it was clear as soon as he opened it up. It was from the Smithsonian Institution, and he says, you know, at the same time that we had a committee meeting with you to talk about the Performing Arts Center, we had another committee meeting with representatives from the Smithsonian Institution, and they gave us this big leather-bound book when they made the presentation to us. We hadn't given them anything at this point. He says they want us to put our name on the third oldest building in Washington, D.C. And he says, you know, the third oldest building in Washington, D.C. is a really important building. And not only in Washington, D.C. is it important, but because it's in Washington, and it's the third oldest building in Washington, D.C., it's probably one of the most important buildings in the entire United States of America. He says, do you know how much they want for us to put our name on the building in Washington, D.C.? I says, no, sir. He says, well, coincidentally, they're also asking for $50 million. He says, we really like this project, but you know, we're not going to give them $50 million. We're going to support it, but we're not going to give them $50 million. So they're starting to set up our Jack-in-the-Box lunch or whatever it was that we're having for lunch that day. And so he says, let's go outside where we can talk quietly. They have a patio outside their boardroom on the second floor. And so we went out there, and they have a teak wood. They had a teak wood patio set, and so it was a low table with a chair here at the end, and a chair here at the end, and a bench here. And Fred instructed me to sit on the bench. So I sat on the bench, and Fred sat on one chair, and Steve Anderson sat at the other chair. And he then started to talk. He says, he said one more time, that was a pretty bold request you made of our committee last week. He said, and don't tell me this is the most important building to be built. He says, but I've just taken the last 20 minutes to share with you how we here at the Reynolds Foundation look at naming opportunities. And I said, and Fred, I really appreciate that. I didn't know all of that, of course. I appreciate you taking the time to do that. So he says, so let me tell you what we're going to do. He says, we're going to give you the $50 million. He says, in addition, he says, my wife and I, Mary, have talked with our family, and we're so impressed by what you and Dee, he calls my wife Dee Dee, he says, we're so impressed by what you and Dee Dee have agreed to do. We had made first commitment for $1 million gift to start the fundraising campaign. We're so impressed by the $1 million gift that you and Dee Dee have given that we, as a family, would like to personally match your $1 million gift. Then he threw his head back and he laughed. And then he said, now I'll bet you wish you would have asked for more.
Now the whole time Don is in this meeting, I'm back at the office biting my fingernails, because this was a big deal. There was going to be no world-class performing arts center in Las Vegas without the Donald W. Reynolds Foundation. I had no fingernails left. Don leaves the meeting. He gets on the car phone back then, and he calls me, and I say, Don, how did it go?
You said, how was lunch?
Don, how was lunch? And what did he say?
I said, well, we had sandwiches and we had a cookie, and it was pretty nice, I think.
And then he says, all right, look, we didn't get what we asked for. We got more. Damn you.
And neither of us could talk for a few minutes.
Yeah, it's true. And if we had the time, we would tell you how that $50 million gift became 200. But maybe there's a 30-second version where you and I can say that we started in this parking lot once again. We prepared for the meeting, had at this time a Jason's Deli box lunch. Don and I and the two of them.
Moved up by this time.
Yes. They had good cookies, by the way. And on that date, we learned that not only was the Reynolds Foundation going to give the $50 million, but because they wanted to see the entire project done at one time and not phased over time, that they thought it'd be a pretty good idea if they just gave us $200 million.
And of course, Fred just couldn't tell us that. He had to put us through the same process that I had gone through before. But I have just nothing but the highest admiration for Fred. The arts weren't in his wheelhouse. I think the Arkansas Razorbacks were more in his wheelhouse. But he clearly understood. He understood what this was going to be. But the other thing that really resonated with him, and I think it's important for a lot of the people in this group that work with nonprofit organizations, is that we made a commitment that this is a real business and we're going to run it like a business. And we had a lot of conversations about that, and him knowing me from my time at the bank, I think really helped him know that I was serious about that. And from that those very early days till today, it is a business. We run it like a business, and that resonates with donors very, very importantly.
When Don says Fred Smith wasn't an artsy-fartsy guy, I will tell you what Fred Smith said at the podium at the press conference when they announced the first $50 million gift next door. He came to the podium and he said, you know, when Don and Myron first talked to us about this world-class performing arts center, I'll be honest with you, I had no idea what they were talking about. He said, my idea of a world-class performing arts center is a beer joint where you hear Willie Nelson.
So anybody who may be wondering why Willie Nelson was in the opening night lineup, and he wasn't.
All right, we are just about out of time, but I think a discussion about the Smith Center and our evolution isn't right without hearing Don Snyder's discussion about firing up the Boyd Gaming jet and taking Mayor Oscar Goodman with us on a little trip.
Well, Oscar Goodman was another person that was from the very beginning a cheerleader, but we also knew from our conversations that he maybe didn't have a real good idea of what it was that we were talking about when we talked about a world-class performing arts center. So we decided we needed to go on a field trip, and so we scheduled a field trip to West Palm Beach, Florida, to see the Kravitz Center. And the reason that we picked that particular location was the Kravitz Center was built right adjacent to, in that case, a 68 or 69 acre development. The development was really spurred by the Kravitz Center. And as you probably all know, our Smith Center is part of 61 acres that the city owned in the old Union Pacific Railroad area. So a lot of similarities, and we had the real estate developer at the time, related companies, that was involved with that project in West Palm Beach. And so we thought that would be a place to go. So this was just in my final months as president of Boyd Gaming. We took the Boyd Gaming plane, as Myron said. And so we took off. We weren't up in the air 5 minutes, but Oscar is reaching in every single pocket of his suit, pulling out little bottles of gin. And I said, Oscar, didn't you think we would have gin on the plane? He says, well, I didn't think you'd have good gin, or certainly not enough. So neither of us had trained for this trip. I mean, when we travel with Oscar, you got to train. But anyway, he drank the whole way to Palm Beach. We stayed at the Breakers Hotel, one of the great hotels in the world in Palm Beach. We got a little bit of a late start, so we arrived in Palm Beach very close to when we had dinner reservations, and Oscar had taken care of the dinner reservations, and so he said, let's just drop off our luggage in our room, if you want to go up to your room and clean up, but let's get back downstairs right away, we have to get to the restaurant.
We'll have one drink in the lobby bar before we go.
Yeah. So I went up, I freshened up, I didn't even unpack, I was down there in 10 minutes. He's already on his second double martini. So By the way, I've told this story to Oscar too, and he likes the story. So he said, well, we had to get going. So we finished the drink, and we went, and these are the days when we didn't have Uber and things like that. So we asked the bell guy to just get us a taxi. So this taxi pulls up, and it's a little miniature car, but they're
Well, not like a clown car.
not a clown car. It's a little Toyota Corolla or something like that, or Datsun in those days.
With Lawrence Weekly.
And so there were 4 of us that were going to pile into this little taxi. So Oscar got up front in the navigator seat. I got right behind the driver. Lawrence Weekly got in the middle seat in the back. He was a city councilman, and this was his district in those days. Does everybody know Lawrence Weekly? Okay, yeah, all right. And then Myron was sitting right behind Oscar in the back seat. So we're driving to the restaurant, and the taxi driver started a conversation like taxi drivers always do. What brings you to Palm Beach? And Oscar says, "You don't know who that is in the back seat of your taxi?" And the guy said, "No, I don't know who that is." He says, "That's the king of Ghana," pointing to Lawrence Weekly. Now, what Oscar had done is looked at the guy's identification and saw that he was from Ghana. So he said, "That's the king of Ghana back there." And the guy said, "It is?" He said, "I'm from Ghana. I'm from Ghana." He said, he's driving and turning around like this. And so we all had our life in his hands. He says, Your Highness, I am so sorry I didn't recognize you." And so the whole time this conversation went on. We got to the restaurant. And the taxi driver jumped out of the car, and he came around, almost practically threw Myron out of the car so he could help the king of Ghana out of the car. And he said,
Get out of the center seat.
He's saying once again, he says, "Your Highness, I am so sorry that I didn't recognize you." And that was the end of the conversation. Nobody told him the truth. So now for the last 20 years or so, he's probably been telling his family and friends how he had
So we go to dinner. We have a great dinner. Oscar has a few more cocktails, but he's the first one up in the morning for breakfast, and we start our tour of the city center complex. And when we complete that, we have lunch, and we walk across the street to the Kravis Center for the Performing Arts. And we're getting the tour. Don mentioned that Oscar had been our greatest cheerleader at this point, and we get the tour, and we're sitting 5th row center at the Kravis Center for the Arts, and I'm sitting right next to Oscar Goodman, and he's looking around. Now, he'd been our best cheerleader. Any chance he got to say, we're the largest community in North America without a world-class performing arts center, and we need to change that, he said it every day. Yet we're sitting in one of these places, and he's looking around, and he says to me, "Is this what we're going to build?"
And our hostess is on the stage telling her story about the Kravis Center. She's talking while this is going on.
Yeah, she's talking. Oscar's asking, "Is this what we're going to build?" And I wanted to say, "Are you kidding me?" But I didn't. I said, "Well, yes, Mayor, something like this." To which he yells out, with the lady still on stage talking, he yells out, "Holy shit, we got to have one of these."
So, I'll tell you, there are a lot of stories. I mean, the miles that we traveled together. I mean, collectively, we didn't all go to all of them, but collectively, we visited probably more than 100 performing arts centers around the world, seeing some that we liked and some that we didn't like, but it really informed what we have today. But from that experience, there are a lot of stories. Those are a couple of our favorite ones.
And there are a lot of stories, but I will tell you, ladies and gentlemen, we're living in a much better city today because of this man. Help me thank him for
guys are back.